Um, so two guys were sitting together at a bar, and one of them was just kind of pathetically shuffling through the bowl of pretzels with his finger and took a sip of his Miller Lite. He said, you know, after the revolution, we're going to have strawberries and cream. And his friend said, yeah. And his friend said, no, actually, you know, come to think of it, I don't like strawberries and cream. His friend said, after the revolution, you will eat strawberries and cream and like it. And I like that one. I really, you know, because there's something about me. I know there's something kind of dated and like Soviet about it. So like, I don't know if my students, I don't think my students would even understand that it was a joke. All right. So we have been talking about Galilee in the time of Jesus, and who was this guy Jesus to the people who knew him? Because let's remember, we don't remember this, but I can tell you because I know. When, you know, Paul, that guy who like went all through the Roman Empire, like telling people about like the Christ and the resurrection and all of this stuff, all of this cosmic stuff. But Paul tells us in his letter to the Galatians that he went, after 15 years of traveling around telling people about the Christ, he went to Jerusalem and he met Jesus's brother James and Jesus's best friend Peter, who were still alive. And he said to them, like, let me tell you about the cosmic Christ and the resurrection and like the redemption of, you know, and sin and all of this stuff. And Jesus's brother and his best friend said, what are you talking about? Like, what are you talking? That's got nothing to do. Like, our friend is dead. Like, what is this stuff that you're saying? And Paul tells us, you know, he said, you know what? We agreed that we should never meet or speak again. But he says, as I was walking out the door, Jesus' brother said, hey, whatever it is you're going to tell people, tell them that my brother cared about the poor. And Paul said, that I can do, that we can agree on. And he left. So this, I think, raises some really interesting questions, because it's an embarrassing moment for Paul. But he shares it anyway. He doesn't know that we're still going to be reading it 2,000 years later. But it raises the question, not who was this God-man that Paul was out telling people about, but who was this friend and brother and son who people knew in Galilee, and then, you know, people knew of in Jerusalem. And that guy, I think, gets kind of lost in all of the like Pauline, you know, shine of, you know, the Christ. Jesus, I don't think he ever heard of the Christ. And a lot of the Christ stuff in the Gospels is kind of taken, is copied out of the letters of Paul. The biographers, the people who wrote the Gospels decades later. They had, in one hand, like little collections of like stories and teachings about this guy Jesus, but in the other hand, they had the letters of Paul, and all of the stories and teachings got kind of rebuilt in this cosmic Christ framework. So, who was this guy Jesus? There is a myth. And every Christian church, while we're in here, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Christian churches meeting on a Sunday morning. And each one of them will tell you some version of this myth. In the beginning, everybody agreed. All of the first Christians agreed about Jesus, who he was, what his relationship with God was, and what he wanted. In the beginning, everybody agreed, and then it began to split. And then it began to fragment until now there are thousands and thousands of Christianities, and none of them can agree on who Jesus was, what his relationship with God was, and what he wanted from us. That is a myth. And you can prove it by just opening up the Bible. Because in 3 of the Gospels, Jesus says to his disciples, while he's still around, he says, "Who do people say that I am?" And one disciple says, "People say that you are Elijah, the prophet, and you have come back from the dead. And some people say that you are John the Baptizer, who was beheaded but is somehow returned." And Peter, the disciple, said, "And some people say that you are the Messiah, the Christ, the descendant of David, the true king of Israel." And Jesus looked at them and he said, "Don't talk to people about what I am." That's what he said. He didn't agree. He didn't answer. He didn't tell anybody that anybody was right. He did not say, you guessed it, I'm the Messiah. He didn't do that. He just said, don't talk with people about this. Why? If he thought he was the Messiah, why might he not have wanted people going around saying that? We'll look at that in a moment. But the Gospels agree, in Jesus' time, when he was around to answer questions about himself, there was already disagreement about who he was and what he wanted. The letters of Paul and the book of Revelation say there are all of these different Christian churches, and they believe this, and they believe that, and they're doing this, and they're doing that, and they're all wrong. And I am right. This lets us know that in the first decades of the early church, there was a great deal of disagreement about who the Christ was, what his relationship with God was, and what he wanted. So, this myth that you'll hear, now, you go to a Methodist church and they'll tell you, the original Christians in the early church, they knew what the Christ was and what he wanted. And there's been a lot of division and confusion since then, but we, the Methodists, are bringing it back to what it should have been, what it was in the beginning, what it always should have been. But then you go into the Catholic Church and they say, in the beginning, everybody agreed. Then there was a lot of confusion, but we keep it the way that it was. And then you go into like Joe Bob's Corner, Lucky Number One Salvation Church, and he says, in the beginning, everybody agreed, and then there was a lot of confusion. But we here at Joe Bob's, we're doing it the way that it was always meant to be done. So this is one of the most powerful myths in Christianity. And again, I only call it a myth because I can prove it with the Bible. Now, in all of this diversity and disagreement and argument, there have always been 3 elements that Christians have had in common. Almost all Christians have had in common. The name Jesus of Nazareth, crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is something, no matter what church you go into, nobody's arguing about this anymore. There was some argument about it in the 300s. We'll look at that later. But nobody argues about, so these 3 things, I'm going to very cautiously, I'm going to refer to these as facts. If we can say anything is fact about Jesus, I would start with this. Now, what we're going to do right now is I'm going to interview these 3 facts. If this was everything, if this was all that we had, how much can we get out of this? We start with the name Jesus, which is the name Joshua. Now, in the Old Testament, when the Hebrews escaped from Egypt and they were led by Moses, Moses was the spiritual leader, and his right-hand man and enforcer and occasional assassin was named Joshua. That was the person who did the dirty work. That was the person who did the killing that needed to be done. Which, during the time in the wilderness, every time the people did something bad, Joshua had to go kill some people. And then when the Hebrews crossed into the promised land and Moses was dead, Joshua took his place as the leader. And he was the one who led the assault on, the walls of Jericho, where they blew the trumpets and the walls came down. That was Joshua. And all of the battles against the Canaanites, that was all led by this guy, Joshua. Let's remember here, the letter J is 500 years old, 400 years old. The letter J is 400 years old. It is one of the two youngest letters in the English language, believe it or not. During the time of Queen Elizabeth of England, the Elizabethan alphabet had 24 letters. And then, in the time of King James of England, during the translation of the King James Bible, it was discovered that 2 more letters were going to be needed. These were the letters, the J. Does anybody want to take a guess what the other one might have been? I don't think we'll get this anyway. It was the letter V. The letters J and V had not existed. They took the old way of writing the Roman numeral and made the letter V. Anyway, so the letter J is very young. Before that, in Latin, you would use the letter I, for the J sound. J is the most common letter for boys' names, like Jesus, James, Joseph, Jeremiah, etc. But the letter J is very recent. Okay. So the name of Jesus in his time would have been something like Yeshua. And I met one of the other ministers who does services here. When he says Jesus, he says, I think something like that. He calls him like Yeshua as a way of distinguishing him from the Jesus of Christianity. And Yeshua is the same name as Joshua, that we would know as Joshua. Who gave him this name? If we look at biblical naming customs, it is the mothers who give names. Babies get names when they are born, and fathers are traditionally not in the tent, or not in the room, or not in the barn, wherever. Fathers in the Bible don't watch births. Mothers give birth, and they name babies. Even in the Gospels, the angel says to Mary, "You're going to have a baby. You will name him Jesus." Joseph never gets a vote about what the name is going to be. That's okay. That was the custom. So this, from the name Jesus, we get, I think, a certain interesting amount of information. This is a name that he got from his mother, and it's a name that means, it literally means in Hebrew, God liberates. Yeshua, like the Hebrew name for God, and then Shua, liberate. God liberates. And that Jesus was, Yeshua was the most common name in Jesus's generation. Statistically, 20%, 1 out of 5 boys who were born in Jesus's time were given the name Yeshua. It was the popular name. Every mother wanted her son to become the next Joshua, the person who blew down the walls of Jericho and defeated the pagans. In Jesus' time, that would be the Romans. Jesus was the most common name. The second most common boys' names were James and Joseph. So, like the Bible has, like when Jesus is arrested, and there's that thing, and Pontius Pilate said, "Which one of these people do you want me to release? Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Barabbas?" It was a very common name. Everybody was named Jesus. There are 2 James. There are 2 disciples named James. There are multiple Josephs in the Gospels. These are just really common names from the time. All right. Jesus. His last name was of Nazareth, which is important. When 1 in 5 boys is named Jesus, you got to be able to say, which Jesus is this? Is this Jesus of, whatever, Jesus of Bethlehem, Jesus of Jerusalem, Jesus of, etc., Magdala. It's like, no, this one was Jesus of Nazareth, one of the Jesuses of Nazareth. And Nazareth, we know, was this like little kind of nowhere town in Galilee, which was kind of a nowhere county. It was far from Jerusalem, and it was kind of like a backwoods little town. I'm trying to think. Lewiston would not be a good parallel. It would be some town that's like 20 miles north of here that you've never heard of. Whatever town Smokin' Joe's is in. Oh, like the reservation, that would be a good thing. If Niagara Falls, or let's say if Manhattan was Jerusalem, Nazareth would be like the reservation where Smokin' Joe's is. It would be like this little place that was not even on the radar of Manhattan. This we know about Nazareth. There is a story where in the Gospel of John, where the disciples pass by a guy who is sitting under a tree. They say like, hey, we found the Messiah. He is from Galilee. The guy under the tree said, can anything good come out of Galilee? Like nobody really thought much of this place. All right. Jesus of Nazareth. So if this is a fact, and I'm willing to bet that it is, that is what we can get just from that, which I think is a pretty good place to start. Crucified. Let's remember that in the Roman Empire, there were 2 primary forms of execution. If you were a criminal, a violent criminal, if you were a thief, if you were a murderer, they would not waste you on a cross. They would put you in the arena, and people would pay money to watch you fight to the death as a gladiator. Crucifixion was only used for people who disrupted the flow of wealth, the flow of taxes to the Roman Empire, and slaves who disobeyed their masters. These were the 2 circumstances under which a person would get crucified. So from crucified, we get a certain amount of information. We may remember, one of the questions like, what would the Torah say about should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus famously said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. We'll come back and take a closer look at that in a future session. But the crucifixion of Jesus, it was an economic crime. It had something to do with economics. And it lets us know that he and his followers were not considered violent. If they had been considered violent, they would have been rounded up. Not just him, but the officers who arrested them would have rounded up all of his followers too and put them all into the arena to fight gladiators. So the idea that Jesus was a non-violent protester and that it was clearly understood that he was non-violent, this is supported by crucifixion. And this third thing that Christians everywhere tend to agree on, under Pontius Pilate, crucified in the time of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the governor of Jerusalem from the year 26 to the year 36. How much do we know about that? For one thing, we've got this idea that Jesus died at the age of 33. Let's remember that there is no birth certificate and there is no death certificate. We can be fairly confident that Jesus died between the year 26 and 36, but they weren't telling time that way at the time. Nobody, when Jesus was born, said this is now year 0. The birth year of Jesus was determined 1,000 years later by someone who said, according to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was born just before Herod the Great died. Therefore, he must have been born in this year. They miscalculated Herod the Great died in the year -4. So if Jesus lived at the same time as Herod the Great, he must have been 4 years old in what we call year 0. So we have no idea. We have no idea when Jesus was born. He was crucified between the year 26, the year 36, so that really, it doesn't tell us much about, doesn't tell us anything for sure about his age. Pontius Pilate, we do know this about him. The Gospels tend to present Pontius Pilate as a kind of puppet, as a weak-willed person who can be bullied by the Jerusalem priesthood into doing what they say. But we know this about Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate had so many people crucified without trial that the Roman Empire called him back to Rome. They said, you kill too many people. You are a threat to the flow of wealth because you kill too many people without trial. They called him back to Rome in the year 36. He vanishes from history. He never makes it there. He just disappears. Maybe he ran off thinking the Romans were going to execute him. Maybe somebody killed him on the road. We have no idea what happened. He just vanishes. Okay, but Pontius Pilate, would he really like beat his breast and cry and like weep and wail over like the death of some innocent guy from Galilee? No, that does not match what we know historically about him. There is an old story, maybe apocryphal. How did Pontius Pilate end up the governor of Jerusalem? It is said that one day he was at a banquet at the emperor's house and he just passed gas really loudly right in the middle of this big party. And the emperor pointed at him and said, I'm sending you to Jerusalem. So like that wasn't where anybody wanted to be. According to the old story, it was like this kind of awful punishment that you could get as a sort of joke. Anyway, okay. What crime was Jesus officially executed for? Above his head, they put a sign, according to the Gospels, that said, King of the Jews. When Jesus was, in the Gospels, when Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, the trial is one question, one answer. Are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus says something. He says, like, if you say so, if you say so. What it meant to be King of the Jews at the time was that Rome had chosen you to be their tax collector in the area. That's how you became the king. The crown was something that you could rent, and once you had the crown, you could collect taxes. What Pontius Pilate is asking him is not, are you like descended from David? Pontius Pilate doesn't know or care about David. Pontius Pilate's question is, are you telling people that you can collect taxes? Are you telling people that Rome has made you the king? The crime for which Jesus was executed was technically tax fraud. He was accused of committing tax fraud, of telling people that he could collect taxes on behalf of the Roman Empire. We don't really think about that because the Gospels clearly show like he doesn't collect any money. But that was what the Romans would have considered a crime. And if he had been going around telling people, I am the King of the Jews, then they would have said, oh, you're the person I give my taxes to. You're the tax collector. Here are my taxes. Then he would have been guilty of tax fraud. Then he would have deserved to get crucified. Jesus, this is it. He was nonviolent, as far as we know. Again, as I said, if he had been a violent person, they would have put him in the arena. If he was a person who like encouraged violence, they would have done that. But he was still considered to be too dangerous to live. And remember, because we often forget, sounding like a bland greeting card was not a crime punishable by death on the cross. Like boring people to death by saying love your neighbor, like, was not going to get you crucified. You might lose the crowd, but you weren't going to get executed for it. In the gospel, according to Luke, there are a bunch of people like gathered on a sidewalk on whatever Saturday morning, and they're like having a little town meeting. And the first public act of Jesus is that he jumps in the middle of this town meeting and he quotes from the scroll of his favorite prophet, Isaiah. He says, "The Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. The Lord has sent me to proclaim the release of the captives and to let the oppressed go free." Good news for the poor. During the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most famous things that he ever said, blessed, and by blessed, he doesn't mean, because I know that for us, blessing is like a magical, like a supernatural thing, like a person is blessed and they start glowing or, whatever. That is not what he means here. What he actually means is like dignified, like you have dignity. Dignified are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Dignified are you who are hungry, for you will be filled. These are very nice things to say. Now, how are the hungry people going to get filled? Is this all going to be done through like the miraculous multiplication of loaves and fishes? Or is he talking about like, let them eat pie in the sky? Actually, the next thing he says is, "But there is trouble for you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. And there's trouble for you who are full, for you will be hungry." Now so it's really famous when he says, people who are hungry will get food. That sounds good. But he also says, people who have a lot of food are going to lose their food. Their food is going to be taken away. So Jesus is not writing checks from the bank of paradise. He is saying, you're hungry, you're going to have stuff. The people who have stuff now, they're going to be hungry. Anyone, could hear this and say, this is where the food is going to come from. So when we think about Jesus giving good news to the poor, people in his time did not believe that you could like miraculously make food poof into existence. Good news for the poor had to be bad news for the wealthy, and everybody who heard him would have known that. If there's good news for one person, it's going to be bad news for somebody else. He also got people's attention by being kind of clever and maybe kind of darkly comical. He famously said, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. If someone wants to sue you and take your coat, give them your cloak as well. Now, are people really going to like gather around this guy who just tells them that if you're being abused, the best thing you can do is ask for more abuse? We got to put this into its native context. What he's saying here is, if a right-handed person slaps you across your right cheek, it means that they're using the back of their hand. It means that they are not just hitting you, but they're hitting you as if it should be understood that you are inferior to them. For example, police brutality in the time of Jesus was, that Roman centurions could go around and just strike people on the street with the back of their hand. Now, when this happens, you've got these two options. Like if a police officer hits you, your one option is to hit them back, obviously. The problem is if you do that, then they're going to put you in chains and they're going to put you in the arena and you will die fighting some gladiator. Or you can just kind of shut up and take a step back. And if you do that, then you're letting that person know, I agree. I agree that this is the way things should be. Now, Jesus does this other thing, which I think is a good example of this kind of quirky sense of humor that people remembered him for. He said, you know, if somebody strikes you with the back of their hand, you should not back down and not hit them, but you should just turn your face and say, you know, if you're going to hit me, at least hit me like an equal. You should turn the other cheek. He's saying here that you should really make that person at least think for a moment about what assumptions, what makes them think that it's okay to hit you in this way. So he's not just telling people to take more abuse. He's telling people to stand up for themselves, but in a non-violent way, in a way that's not going to get them arrested or killed. Similarly, he says, if somebody sues you and takes your coat, give them your cloak as well. Now here the translators have done us a bit of a disservice. In Jesus' time, a person only owned 2 articles of clothing. You did not have drawers, you didn't have extra clothes at home. You wore everything you owned. One of them was kind of like a heavy outer coat that was also your sleeping bag. It was also your blanket. You didn't have any bedding. Nobody owned any bedding. So you had your sleeping bag that you wore all the time. And then to protect your body from like the roughness of that, you had this kind of thin, kind of like a shift, this single thing. And that was your underwear, and that was everything. Like, for example, when the Gospels tell us that Jesus was about to be crucified, it says, then people cast lots. They gambled. They played a gambling game to see who would get his clothes. They named 2 items of clothing. The painters say he was painted in his underwear. Nobody in his time wore underwear. Everybody was crucified naked. Here, I think the painters are doing us a favor. But he owned only 2 things. And actually, your coat, your outer coat, the average cost of one was a denarius, which would be the equivalent of like 50 to 75 bucks. It was actually like, it did have value. And you mended it yourself. You did not replace it. You just kept patching it all your life. So when it says like, then people gambled for Jesus's clothes, they're gambling actually for something that's worth like 75 bucks. You can take it and resell it. Your outer coat was the last thing that you could lose in a debt. So if you lost your flocks, and you lost your fields, and you lost your house, if the debt collectors had collected everything else, the last thing they could come for was your outer coat. And you gave them that, and that was your death sentence. That was the end of you. You no longer had a sleeping bag. It meant that you were out on the street in your underwear, and you had not long to live. So Jesus says this thing. He says, you know what? When the debt collectors come and they say, I'm going to take your coat, I'm going to take your sleeping bag. And he's saying, you know what? At that point, your story is over. You're dead anyway. So if they do, you might as well give them your underwear too. And just let everybody see, like, yes, I'm walking away naked because this person needed to take my coat for a debt. Here again, Jesus does not say, when the debt collectors come for the last thing you own, get violent, because that's going to get you into more trouble. That's going to make things worse. Then you're going to die on a cross or in the arena or in a debtor's prison. But he also doesn't say, well, just give up. He tells people, he says, there is this other thing. And this I think is what people remembered about Jesus, was that everything in his time seemed like, well, there's only two options. You either fight back or you give up. And he, in his teachings, and he does this, numerous times, but he'll say, like, no, actually, there's this third thing, which isn't fighting back and isn't giving up, but you get them to just really think about, what is it that makes you think that you are entitled to treat somebody in this way? This is going to be the tough one, and this will be our topic in our next session, because one of the most cherished, famous things that he said was, give unto the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and give unto God the things that are God's. And this seems pretty clear. Jesus is saying, yes, you got to pay your taxes. Actually, we're going to look at this in our next session, because people are going to ask him, what would the Torah say about giving silver to Rome? And people are going to be watching him very closely to see, like, well, are you going to tell us, when it comes right down to it, are you going to tell us that we need to give everything we have to this empire, or are you going to tell us that we have to fight? And Jesus, as always, he's going to find some third way through this. So that'll be our cliffhanger for next time. Do we have any questions about what we looked at today?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because, the way I look at it, talking to friends, talking to family members, when Jesus says, someone hits you, turn the other cheek.
Uh-huh.
And I always viewed that as like a giving up.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, fight back. We were from the belief that, oh, we should fight back. But the way that you're explaining it is that was a way of fighting back.
Uh-huh, yeah.
When Jesus said, turn the other cheek, is it like almost an act of defiance, like, go ahead and hit me again, I'm still here?
And I like that, because there is a defiance to it, and there is an insistence upon, keeping your own dignity and letting the person know. In our time, I mean, we still have problems of police brutality, or even police rudeness, or whatever. And if your response to that is to shout and shout angry and vicious words, that's going to make things worse. But then on the other hand, does that mean that we are telling young people, when you see injustice, just lay down and just say, this is all right, it's okay for you to do this? And I do think that there's something in between that can let that person know, no, you're not taking away my dignity. I still have my dignity here. But I'm not going to give you the excuse to escalate and make more trouble for me. I like what you're saying there. And I think it's really, the people, historically, the people who have said turn the other cheek tend to be the hitters,
So basically it's, if I want to survive another day,
Uh-huh.
and have my life have meaning not acting out would be the best thing to do to accomplish that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, he did another one. Another one of his famous things is if somebody, you know, makes you carry their thing for 1 mile, you should carry it 2. And this sounds really nice, but in his time, the Roman centurions who carried 80 pounds of equipment everywhere, they were allowed anywhere in the colonies. They could just grab any person out of the fields or, you know, off the street, anywhere, and just put that 80 pounds on that person and make them carry it for 1 mile. And that you were allowed to do. However, if you were caught with a person still carrying your stuff after 1 mile, they would make you run the gauntlet. They would punish you. And their punishment was, they would line up everybody in your garrison, all the soldiers, each one with a stick, and you had to run between these 2 lines, and every single person got to hit you as you went through. That was running the gauntlet. So even that famous saying of Jesus, if somebody makes you carry their pack for 1 mile, carry it 2. If somebody did carry a centurion's pack for 2 miles and the centurion got caught, he would be the one who would be in a great deal of trouble. So yeah, this is what I personally like about Jesus, is that he's this kind of subversive humorist, but I don't think he really wants to get killed. And I don't, he does want to find a way out. Good, excellent, good. Well, we will continue. So, like I said, I've got this. I don't know. I'm going to find out sometime soon when my surgery is. I am planning on coming back here. I'm scheduled to come back here the last Sunday of November, which I look forward to doing. If that happens to be like the week when I'm stuck in bed, I'll let you know, and maybe I'll do a Zoom service. But good. Otherwise, I'll see you in a few weeks.
Don't push yourself.
Yeah, I know that is good, and I will push myself. As a matter of fact, Elizabeth